For those of you who are already familiar with the great anatomist William Hunter's life, it may seem odd to commemorate him here at the College of Physicians, an institution which I would say roundly rejected Hunter and his achievements in his lifetime. While William Hunter is undoubtedly an 18th century success story, a Scottish surgeon who rose up from relative obscurity to become a midwife to the Queen of England, he was always an outsider in the London medical profession as defined by this college. Not to get into it too in depth, but if you were a doctor in the Georgian era and you wanted to make it big in medicine, there were a few things you needed: to be English, to be from an Anglican family, to study at Oxford or Cambridge, and to be elected a fellow of this college. With these tools, jobs at prestigious hospitals would have opened up to you. But Hunter had none of these. I think the great historian Roy Porter said it best when he said, William Hunter had his start in life in the wrong country, Scotland, in the wrong religion, Presbyterianism. In 1731, he matriculated into the wrong university, Glasgow, destined for the wrong profession, the ministry. But despite this unfortunate start, Hunter succeeded in medicine, making his way in the new but still stigmatized profession of an accoucheur, or man midwife, and running one of the most famous private anatomy schools in London, if not the entire country. As a graduate of a Scottish university, Hunter was kept at arm's distance by the College of Physicians. He was allowed to become a lowly licentiate, but never allowed to join the in crowd as a fellow. And in the 1760s, he actually pushed for reform of the fellowship rules of the college. As a part of a group of like-minded doctors, they started by filing a lawsuit against the college. But after years of rejection, Hunter and this group actually broke into the college council on 2 separate occasions, breaking the gates and smashing the windows with crowbars. Which is pretty amazing. But despite this radical action led by Hunter, the college didn't change its rules about fellowship admission until 1835, 50 years after William Hunter had died. So Hunter would find it hilarious, if possibly offensive, that we display portraits of him here in the college, including his famous painting by the artist Johann Zoffany of William Hunter demonstrating at the Royal Academy, which is from his personal collection. The painting was gifted to us by Hunter's nephew, Matthew Bailey, who was a fellow of this college, so maybe with his descendants, things have kind of come full circle. Unfortunately, you can't see this painting here tonight in real life. That's because the real one is up in Glasgow at the Hunterian Museum at Williams Hunterian as a part of their celebratory exhibition, so do go up and see that if you have the opportunity. So I had great fun organizing tonight with my former colleague, Hayley Kruger at the Royal College of Surgeons, because I think too often William is left out of John's story, and John from Williams. I don't think it's possible to understand 18th century medicine and anatomy without considering them together, and I think that, in fact, their story can tell you a lot about the historical rivalries between physicians and surgeons. So with that, I'm going to pass you over to Hayley, who will introduce you to our speaker this evening.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for all coming tonight. This is a brilliant turnout for what we hope you are finding to be a great event. I'm not going to now give you chapter and verse on John Hunter. I will just say to you, please come and visit us in late 2021 when John Hunter's Museum, the Hunterian at the Royal College of Surgeons, reopens. We'd very much like to see you back again. And indeed, William Hunter will have his place at the museum because, as we have said, really without William, there would not have been a John. Their stories are very much part and parcel. But you're not here to listen to me, you are here to listen to Wendy Moore. Wendy Moore is an award-winning journalist. She is the author of 4 books on social and medical history, and her first book, The Knife Man, which will obviously be on sale at the Royal College of Surgeons one day, a biography of 18th century surgeon John Hunter, won the UK Medical Journalists Association Consumer Book Award. Her latest book is The Mesmerist, the society doctor who held Victorian London spellbound, and she's currently writing about the Endell Street Military Hospital, which was run entirely by women in London during the First World War. And I'd like to invite her up here to start.
Thank you very much indeed for that lovely introduction. It's a real pleasure and honour to be here tonight at the Royal College of Physicians, supported by the Royal College of Surgeons, to talk about William's 300th anniversary. It's actually a rare opportunity for me to talk about William and John Hunter together. And in fact, the two brothers are very rarely discussed together. As you just heard, over the last 3 centuries, William has really been very much eclipsed by his younger brother, John. There's still no full-length biography of William, and he's scarcely known outside medical history circles. But in their time, the Hunter brothers both stood at the summits of their respective medical professions. So they were twin medical colossuses. William, the esteemed physician, a renowned teacher of anatomy, and the go-to man midwife for the rich and famous. John, the most popular surgeon of his day, the best-known anatomist, both of human and animal anatomy, and a revered teacher of surgery. So together and apart, they made significant contributions to medicine. But temperamentally, they were very different people, complete opposites. Now, it's sometimes said that it is impossible to like both of the brothers. You have to pick one or the other. Well, of course, I will remain completely neutral tonight. Some people prefer the brilliant, gregarious, exuberant John. Others favour the snobbish, vain, self-promoting William. I wouldn't possibly judge between them. Well, as you can tell, passions do run deep in this story. And why is that? Well, I was tempted to call my talk William and John Hunter a love story. Because a few years back, my biography of John was actually optioned for a possible TV series. It was going to be a fictionalised dramatisation of John's life, but largely based on the facts. So, John Hunter was going to be played by Tom Hollander, William Hunter by Danny Mays, and, of course, there was a love interest. They were both rivals for the hand of one woman, played by Jennifer Ely. Well, we had a lot of fun making the pilot. Sadly, perhaps it never did get the green light. But I remember the scriptwriter telling me what had inspired him most to write the drama. And he said it was a love story. Not a love story competing for Jennifer Ely, but a love story between the two brothers. The tales of their rows and rivalry, their intense loyalty, and ultimate betrayal. And I think he was right, because the story of William and John Hunter is a bromance. It's a love between two brothers which ended tragically. Together, William and John forged an extraordinarily fruitful partnership which produced significant discoveries and innovations in medicine, advances which still benefit us today. And then it all fell apart. So why did this beautiful brotherly relationship go so catastrophically wrong? Well, to answer that, we need to go back to their family beginnings. Well, William and John Hunter were born 10 years apart, and they died 10 years apart, which, if nothing else, makes the dates very convenient for a biographer to remember. And they came from relatively humble beginnings. They lived in this farmhouse, which the family actually shared with animals in the winter at Long Calderwood near Glasgow. And it was a big family. The children slept in box beds, which used to pull out from the walls like drawers. And there were 10 children in all, although only 3 survived into their 30s. So William was the 7th child, John was the 10th and last. But they were very, very different personalities right from the start. Big brother William was an intelligent, scholarly, industrious boy. He did well at school, and he went to Glasgow University when he was 13 with a view to going into the church. Then he changed course, and he was taken on as a pupil by the family doctor, William Cullen, a brilliant physician, who dispatched William to Edinburgh University to study anatomy. And at 22, William moved to London in order to learn midwifery with the intention of returning to Scotland and setting up in partnership with Cullen. So all quite simple, really. But John could scarcely have been more different. He was the baby of the family, he was his mother's favourite child, and he was doted on by his 4 older sisters. And like William, he went to the village school, but John absolutely hated lessons. He had huge difficulties learning to read, and it's most probable that he was actually dyslexic. And he frequently played truant. So rather than sitting in a stuffy classroom, he preferred to roam the local countryside, collecting birds' eggs and catching small mammals, which he probably dissected in the local fields. So he was incurably questioning and curious. And there's a lovely description in which he recalls his childhood. He says, "I wanted to know about the clouds and the grasses, why the leaves changed colour in the autumn. I watched the ants, bees, birds, tadpoles, and caddisworms. I pestered people with questions about what nobody knew or cared anything about." And he would carry on asking questions all his life. And I actually think it's precisely because he was dyslexic, and so therefore he could not find the answers to the questions he was asking in books, that he was forced to rely on his own observations and investigations. And it was this mode of learning, essentially learning by discovery, which laid the framework for the doctrine that he later pioneered, that surgery should be founded on scientific evidence. So as children then, William was dutiful and hardworking, John was stubborn and wild. And their sister Dorothy defined the difference, I think, rather well. She said, "William was of a diligent and careful disposition, indefatigable in making himself master of anything that he wished to know, while Johnny, or Jock as he was often known, would do nothing but what he liked, and neither liked to be taught reading, nor writing, nor any kind of learning." So with no obvious ambitions, no particular talents, John actually left school when he was 13, and he had no further formal education, and then he kicked his heels on the farm before being sent off to learn carpentry. At least he proved to be good with a knife. And in fact, there was another brother too, James, who was actually older than William and John, who was regarded as the brightest star of the whole family. Though in reality, I think he was a little bit of a dilettante myself. He first studied law, he briefly enlisted in the army, he dabbled in painting, he decided to become a writer, before finally he turned to medicine and he teamed up with William in London. But James died not long before their father, and that left William as the head of the family, which I think is quite significant. And it was soon after this, after James's death, that John, at the age of 20, came to London in 1748 to join William at his new anatomy school in Covent Garden. Well, John arrived in the heaving metropolis of filthy, smelly, noisy Georgian London, a raw, uncouth Scottish country lad, and knocked on William's door. And it's a lovely picture of Covent Garden, and I chose that one because if you look on the kind of row of houses on the right-hand side, the furthest one on the left was their anatomy school. Not in actually 1748, but in 1749. It was one great piazza. Well, the brothers were virtually strangers at this point. They'd not seen each other since John was 12. And William, who was now 30, was really more of a father figure than an elder brother. And I think William must have been quite surprised and perhaps a little bit disappointed by the sight of this red-headed, awkward, rough youth standing on his doorstep. And this is William in his finery with his wig and his lovely velvet coat. John looking quite different with one of his favourite dogs, and the dog, incidentally, was half dog and half wolf. But William had not been idle since arriving in London 8 years earlier. An ambitious social climber, William had smoothed his Scottish accent and anglicised his manners to ingratiate himself in London high society. So he dressed in fine clothes, he wore a full wig, and he mixed in intellectual circles. He was a brilliant networker. He had already qualified as a surgeon, and he'd also studied anatomy in Paris and Leiden. But William had ambitions. He wanted to become a physician at the top of the medical tree, and specifically a man midwife, the most lucrative area of medicine. So to that end, he actually broke his partnership with William Cullen and forged a new partnership with an up-and-coming doctor, James Douglas, even becoming engaged to the Douglas daughter, Martha. But unfortunately, Douglas had died suddenly, and Martha had followed her father to the grave. So that was the end of another professional partnership, and William would never become romantically entangled again, not even for Jennifer Ely. Well, undeterred, William was on his way to establishing himself as a fashionable man midwife, an accoucheur, to use the term that was fashionable at the time, to the aristocracy, as well as a physician. So he would shortly be granted an honorary degree in medicine from Glasgow University so that he could call himself Doctor rather than Mr. Hunter. And he was about to enter this institution, not of course this building, but the Royal College of Physicians. Although, as Christine mentioned, because his degree came from a Scottish university rather than Oxford or Cambridge, he was only allowed to become a licentiate rather than a full fellow, notwithstanding the fact that the medical education in Scotland was far superior to anything at Oxbridge. Well, this, not surprisingly, rankled with William, and so he was later involved in a protest march on the RCP's headquarters to demand that Scottish graduates be given the same rights as those from Oxbridge, as well as breaking a few windows. But as well as being a refined man about town, William had a smart business head. So his anatomy school in Covent Garden was a brilliant example of private enterprise. Opened in 1746, so 2 years before John arrived in London, the school had already become a roaring success. And the reason for this was very simple. Most anatomy courses in London offered students the chance to watch dissection. William guaranteed his pupils the opportunity to do dissection. Unique in the British Isles, the school provided every pupil with his own corpse during a course lasting 4 months. So medical students flocked to enrol from all over Britain, Europe and America. Well, of course, the secret of the school's success was a regular supply of fresh bodies. And since there were no bodies legally available to private anatomy schools, the vast majority were supplied by grave robbers, the so-called resurrection men. With as many as 100 pupils enrolling for each term, the school clearly needed a substantial number of corpses. And it was largely because of this need that John now found himself in London. William's previous assistant, whose main role had been to liaise with the body snatchers, had just left. And so William needed a new, pliable and trustworthy young man to replace him for the start of the autumn term. So it was now John's job to procure the school's essential teaching material. Well, at first, all went well. John became William's assistant and his pupil. He learnt dissection under William's tuition, and he attended William's lectures. And he took on the seamy side of the business too. At first, John probably went out alone and with a group of students, emboldened by a few bevies in a Covent Garden tavern, to dig up bodies from local graveyards. But as demand increased, he recruited professional body snatchers who delivered freshly dug up corpses to the back door of the school every night. And that particular sketch is supposed to depict William Hunter on the right, running away from the watchmen. The little note you could just barely see in the corner actually says William W. Hunter's lectures. So while William, the self-made man, sucked claret with his intellectual friends in coffee houses, John, the self-taught youth, caroused with the resurrection men in taverns. And John became their favourite customer, and it was a connection that would last his entire life. In the 12 years that the brothers worked together in Covent Garden, John dissected, by his own estimate, some 2,000 bodies. That's roughly 150 a year. And he would continue to dissect more bodies and rely more heavily on the body snatchers than any anatomist of the time. In the most dramatic case, he paid £500, and that's equivalent to about £80,000 today, for a single corpse, the body of Charles Byrne, the self-styled Irish giant. Well, for the time being, while John continued in William's shadow, the relationship was harmonious. And that lovely sketch that's supposed to depict the brothers, William's meant to be standing on your left with a blue jacket, and John is apparently on his right. I don't know how anyone's decided that really, because it's quite difficult to tell who's who. But they're shoulder to shoulder. I think that's the important point. But quite quickly, John surpassed his older brother at dissection. That carpentry training had come in handy, and particularly in the art of making specimens, or preparations, as they were known. So after 12 months, William put John in charge of the dissecting room. So William gave lectures on the principles of anatomy from his podium, and John demonstrated the relevant parts to the pupils and taught them dissection and also how to make preparations in the dissecting room. By 1755, William had made John a partner in the school, and it was a glorious partnership while it lasted. William was without doubt a brilliant orator, an inspirational teacher, and a skilled communicator. And John was the first to admit this. He said his brother had reduced the pompous oratorical mode of lecturing to the simple and familiar description which probably no man could excel. And the spelling, I should point out, is John's. At the same time, John's dexterity at dissection was peerless. Without sophisticated microscopes, often without any microscope at all, working on rotting bodies in a foul-smelling room, John produced some of the most delicate, most exquisite specimens of human and animal parts that have ever been created. And William certainly agreed on that score. As William said, when he was crediting his younger brother's help at one point, John's accuracy in anatomical researches is so well known that to omit to mention this opportunity of thanking him for that assistance would be, in some measure, to disregard the future reputation of the work itself. And you can see John's handiwork for yourselves in the human specimens that he produced and some of the most beautiful animal specimens too. And I know surgeons today who come to see these are still in awe of what he managed to achieve. And in fact, in 1753, when William was elected Master of Anatomy to the Company of Surgeons, so forerunner to the College of Surgeons, he was criticised for simply reading his lecture while he got John to do the hands-on dissection for him. So together, they made a perfect team. William was immensely well-read, so he knew the history of anatomy and all the latest anatomical knowledge better than anyone else. John didn't care about books, of course. It was bodies he was interested in. And at one point, the father of an American pupil asked him what books would his son study under John's tuition. So John simply flung open the door of his dissection room where there were half a dozen corpses lying ready, and he said, These are the books your son will learn under my direction. The others are fit for very little. And through his relentless investigations in the dissecting room, John certainly knew the human body better than anyone else. So he knew what lay beneath. So together, William and John taught anatomy to hundreds of medical students who went on to build successful careers in surgery and medicine here and abroad. Some of their American pupils went back home and set up the first anatomy schools in America, complete with the style of producing the dissection material too, I should say. And William and John, and later their nephew Matthew Bailey, championed the study of morbid anatomy, the new science of identifying illness from diseased organs after death. And although it's true the brothers did rely heavily on bodies stolen from graves, I think it's significant that they also did as much as they could to make post-mortems socially acceptable for the first time, so that families would then agree to have their loved ones dissected after death for the benefit of science. And together, they made significant medical discoveries. They demonstrated that the lymphatic vessels formed a separate circulatory system. They described the descent of the testes. They explained how congenital hernias develop, and they charted the development of the fetus in the womb. But there lies the rub, because just as explorers were competing to claim uncharted lands for themselves, so anatomists vied to discover new anatomical territory, unmapped parts of the body for themselves. And it was William and John's mutual ambition to claim this new anatomical territory that would bring the house tumbling down. Because although John had been made a partner in William's school, he was not an equal partner in William's eyes. William determined, for the most part, which anatomical research his younger brother should investigate. He laid claim to the discoveries that John made, and he even took possession of most of the specimens that John produced. So during the 12 years they worked together in Covent Garden, John was only allowed to keep a handful of the preparations he made. The majority would end up in William's collection at the Hunterian Museum in Glasgow, where they remain to this day. And it was not just John that suffered from that attitude. William would go on to have disputes with other assistants who likewise complained that he appropriated their discoveries and their handiwork. As far as William was concerned, he was bankrolling the work, and therefore he had the rights to the spoils. Well, at first, John was content to play a supporting role to William's star performance. Naturally, he looked up to his older, wiser, and more sophisticated brother. But as John gained in years and knowledge, this inequality festered. The rift between them would not split apart for some years, but its roots lay in the dissecting room in Covent Garden. And the most serious of these disputes concerned the anatomy of the pregnant woman. Well, up until this point, knowledge of the pregnant woman and the development of the fetus had been fairly primitive. Most anatomical drawings showed the fetus as a fully formed human being, like a little person, or homunculus as it was called, and which simply grew bigger during pregnancy. And since women in pregnancy were very rarely dissected, they weren't hanged, they were rarely taken from graves, this was understandable. But William, the ambitious man midwife, was determined to produce a new anatomical atlas which accurately depicted all the stages of pregnancy step by step. Now, the brothers' dubious connections were vital to this project. Through their usual contacts, they procured the bodies of women at various stages of pregnancy. John dissected the corpses, skillfully revealing the fetus at different stages of development, and a Dutch artist, Jan van Rimsdijk, made meticulous sketches of the handiwork. In one of these pregnant bodies, John revealed the lining of the pregnant womb, and William promptly claimed this as his discovery and named it the decidua. the decidua. And then another pregnant corpse, which John actually dissected independently with a friend, an anatomist named Colin Mackenzie, John revealed the circulation of blood in the placenta, proving that the maternal and fetal blood supplies remain separate. And when John told William what he'd seen, William claimed this discovery too, and even took possession of that specimen. Well, it would be another 25 years before William published the fruits of all this research in his book, The Human Gravid Uterus, in 1774. And by any account, William's book was a triumph. Published as an elephant folio, so that's nearly 2 feet by 1.5 feet in size, it shows the pregnant womb and the fetus in its different stages in 34 plates in almost photographic detail. As you can see, it is an exquisitely beautiful drawing, but also quite very shocking too. So the mission to depict the fetus throughout pregnancy was William's. He supervised it and he financed the work. But 16 of the 34 plates in the book show bodies which were actually dissected by John, and 31 were drawn by Rimstick. But John, however, barely gets a mention, and Rimstick gets none at all. But most significantly in this book, William laid claim to this discovery not only of the decidua, but also the circulation of the placenta. But it would be another 2 decades before the row would explode wide open. Well, after 12 years together, by 1760, tensions in Covent Garden had become strained, and so the brothers parted company. John went off to join the army as a surgeon and spent the next 3 years on foreign battlefields. William stayed in London, building up his practice. And from this point, William and John led separate but increasingly divergent lives. So William scaled the slippery medical ladder to become the most popular man midwife of his day. He delivered all 15 of the royal children. He was appointed physician in extraordinary to Queen Charlotte, and he came renowned for bringing into the world the babies of the rich and famous, as well as their illegitimate offspring, which he would discreetly whisk away. And in one case, he apparently delivered one aristocratic young woman, the daughter of a peer, of twins, which he then sent to the Foundling Hospital. And I must admit, I always thought that story was probably apocryphal, until a couple of weeks ago, I actually heard from the Foundling Hospital Museum that they have documents which record 2 boys named George and Joseph, who were admitted on Christmas Day 1767 with donations of £100 each, and that meant that no questions were asked. And with them were left, as tokens, 2 playing cards. And on the cards, the name Hunter is written. Well, in the meantime, William had set up a new anatomy school in Great Windmill Street, which attracted students from far and wide. And he became extremely rich and invested his wealth in artworks, in rare books and coins, while he always lived very frugally. Occasionally, he did give handouts to friends and family. He sometimes did help John. John was always in need of money. And he also supported their sister Dorothy when she was widowed and her 3 children. But according to John, he was, in the strictest sense, a miser. William would never marry. John, meanwhile, returned from the army to set up on his own as a surgeon in London. He would become the highest paid surgeon of the time. He was appointed surgeon extraordinary to George III, and he was an extraordinary surgeon. He treated the celebrities of the day, including Adam Smith, who he treated for piles. Adam Smith came down from Scotland to have his piles treated by John, which must have been quite an uncomfortable journey by 18th century stagecoach. And he treated William Pitt. He went on to publish pioneering works on teeth, on venereal disease, on gunshot wounds and inflammation, as well as papers on natural history and geology, and ultimately he outlined early theories of evolution. John taught some 1,000 pupils, who became his disciples and spread his doctrine that all surgery should be founded on scientific principles. But the brotherly relationship was now in terminal decline. While he was in the army, John sent affectionate letters to William. But within 2 months of returning to London, they had quarrelled, probably over William's appropriation of some of John's specimens. When John married Anne Hume, who was a society beauty and a poet, in 1771, William did not attend. There's John and Anne. You may think he's punching above his weight, rather. She was renowned as a society beauty and a muse of Haydn, as well as a poet in her own right. The day before the wedding, John sent William a note, and in it he said, "Tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock at St. James's Church, I enter into the holy state of matrimony. As that is a ceremony which you are not particularly fond of, I will not make a point of having your company there." That said it. Despite the acrimony, they still came together occasionally for professional purposes. They examined various new animal species together. They jointly attended an attempt at a caesarean operation, and they were both present for the unwrapping of an Egyptian mummy. And for 2 years, in 1777 and 78, John actually gave his lectures on surgery in William's Lecture Theatre at Great Wimwell Street. But that was the last time they worked together, the end of their beautiful partnership, because 2 years later, the storm broke. On the 27th of January, 1780, the Georgian medical world was stunned when John stood up at the Royal Society to give a paper entitled "On the Structure of the Placenta." Well, it was 26 years since John and Colin Mackenzie had made their discovery of the circulation of the placenta. It was 6 years since William had published his book, The Human Gravid Uterus. But only now did John accuse his brother of plagiarism. And in front of the shocked Royal Society audience, John alleged that William had usurped his discovery as his own. Well, in reply, William blustered that he had acknowledged his brother's help as an excellent assistant. And furthermore, it was he who trained John in anatomy in the first place. But John refused to back down, declaring, "I am as tenacious as he is to anatomical discovery, and I flatter myself as tenacious also of truth." And William gave no reply. But why had the row erupted at that moment? Why had John waited 2 decades to make his claim? Well, almost certainly the trigger was something else entirely. One contemporary claimed the quarrel was due to the fact that John had invited William to a post-mortem, and William had then waltzed off with one of the specimens. So perhaps that theft, a quarrel over a pound of flesh, was the last straw which prompted John to protest at all the previous thefts. But I think there were fundamental differences which had actually reached a head at this point. For William, always devout and God-fearing, originally intended for the church, of course, the human body was always the ultimate divine creation. In his lectures, he made clear his belief that the beauty of the human anatomy was the work of God. John, however, always believed that it was nature, not God, that was responsible for the wonders of life. And he even at one point said he believed that faith in a system without evidence, such as religion, was a sign of weakness. In his lectures, John argued as well that early life on Earth had probably appeared spontaneously from inorganic matter, so not the story that was still widely believed from the Bible at that point. So he was setting himself on a collision course with the church and the Georgian establishment. The roots of this difference lay, of course, in their youth. While John had studied dutifully for the church, John had always rejected authority and embarked on his solo exploration of nature. But whatever the ultimate cause, the breach was final. In March 1783, John was summoned to William's deathbed, but they were not reconciled. John did not attend William's funeral, And William left his fortune, including the house at Long Calderwood, to his nephew, Matthew Bailey. There was nothing for John. The brotherly love story was over. So together and separately, the Hunter brothers achieved great things for medicine. They shared a roof for 12 years in childhood, for 12 years in Covent Garden, and for 2 years at Great Wimble Street. But fundamentally, they shared very little in temperament, in beliefs, and approach. So today, the emphasis in scientific research is very much on collaboration rather than individual achievement. And William and John provide a superlative example of collaboration while it lasted. Would they have achieved more if their partnership had continued? I don't think so. I think they were simply too different. Yet for all their differences, I think their legacies were very much the same. Their most important achievements were not any particular discovery or innovation, but the doctrine that they taught to thousands of future doctors, that anatomical observation forms the keystone of medicine, a doctrine which I know quite a lot of surgeons and anatomists believe being overlooked today. But who would I most like to spend the evening with? Well, I was at a lecture a couple of weeks ago when the speaker plumped for William. But I probably don't need to tell you who I would prefer to sit next to at my fantasy dinner party. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Wendy, for your talk. Very insightful look and really interesting connections between us and the surgeons, which is why we really wanted to bring this event here tonight. We have some time at the end for some questions. There's a couple of roving microphones. Does anyone have a question about this evening's lecture for Wendy?
Was the style of research and everything they're doing unique at that time, or were they just the best at it? So in the book you describe that, you know, this is all going on, but was this the only place that you could go and cut up real bodies, and or were they, you know, everywhere, and these guys were at the top of their game?
Okay, well, certainly in London, their school was the only place where trainee surgeons, doctors could cut up their own corpses. In Edinburgh, students there were bodies provided, but William talked about there being only 2 or 3 a year, and there were some private anatomy schools as well in Edinburgh and in Glasgow. But in London, definitely, their school was the only place that had such a detail, such a long course which went through every area of the body, every organ in huge detail, and then provided the visual evidence for the students to actually see, as well as preparing specimens which were essentially used as teaching aids for the pupils to see what they were. So it meant that, you know, previously a lot of surgeons may have been at 1 or 2 dissections, but had virtually no experience at all of cutting up bodies before they actually practiced on living bodies, and often had very little knowledge of what actually they were going to find when they went in there. So it was a huge advance in training surgeons, but also physicians as well, for better medical care.
Thank you. How did they get away with the grave robbing? Presumably it was still illegal. And did the law change while they were practicing?
Yeah, how did they get away with that? That's a very good question. Essentially, the establishment turned a blind eye to what they were doing. So bodies were legally provided to the 2 colleges, to the Royal College of Surgeons and the Royal College of Physicians, but only about 6 a year. There were bodies that were hanged were sometimes bought by surgeons, or very occasionally families sold a body to private surgeons. But private anatomy schools really had no legal source at all. So they tried to be discreet. William encouraged his students to always be discreet about where the bodies came from, but it was an open secret that surgeons were obtaining bodies dug up from graves provided by the body snatchers. And the reason there wasn't a huge outcry, certainly to begin with, was that those bodies did not generally belong to the rich and wealthy and powerful. They were the bodies of the poor, so they were people who had no rights, so they were provided, they were just taken basically. But also the government was well aware, the establishment was well aware, that they actually needed good surgeons. They wanted them for themselves and their families, of course, but also for the Navy and the Army. They wanted good trained surgeons who knew what they were doing. So there were one or two prosecutions of body snatchers who were actually taken to court. And it's sometimes said that it was not meant to be illegal to steal a body, but in fact some body snatchers were taken to court and were fined. But as far as I know, I think there was just one or possibly two cases where surgeons were taken to court for receiving the stolen bodies. But although John Hunter was well known by everybody as being the person who took most dead bodies, and the bodies when he lived in his final house in Leicester Square were delivered every night to the back door in what is now Charing Cross Road. And occasionally, people would actually see this, and mobs even tried to stop it. But he was never prosecuted. It was always allowed. Yeah. There's a lady down here as well, by the way.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I've got two questions. One, I had some experience being in Croatia during the war in the 1990s, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and a soldier got on the bus, and he just the absolute stench of death, and it seemed as though it was difficult to remove the stench. So as a practical point, I just wonder, to be able to mix socially, how do they deal with that issue? And the other question, if I may, I wonder whether people from overseas perhaps other parts of Britain came and visited to view what they were doing and perhaps be inspired by it. And one particular person I wonder if you've come across his name was the grandfather of the polymath Rabindranath Tagore. His grandfather, Dwarkanath Tagore, he was in London in 1846 when he died, and he was very much a mover and a shaker in Calcutta, in the medical world, and in making it acceptable for Hindus to do dissection of bodies. So he would actually be present to make it socially acceptable. I just wonder if by any chance you came across his name.
Okay. So yeah, two interesting points. The first point, I love this point about the fact they were cutting up bodies, rotting bodies all day, and then mixing with other people. And it was one of the things that absolutely fascinated me when I was writing the book. What did it actually smell like? And there were descriptions of students who were told, leave your hat, I think, behind, because it would often pick up the smell of the decay. And John Hunter in particular talks very clearly about the five senses. And I think this is really important because they didn't have powerful microscopes or computerized images, they had to use all their five senses. So, obviously they closely examined things. Hunter talks about dissecting bodies in winter when he could hear the crackling of the skin. He talks about the smell. So he would, he obviously became quite accustomed to the smell. They must all have done. But that was part of diagnosis and part of learning. So he would sniff the organs and the fluids. Obviously, feeling was a significant thing too. But he even would taste specimens that they took, so bodily fluids. I'll leave your imagination to decide which bodily fluids, but I can tell you there were none that he didn't try, and he describes what they tasted like as well. So that was all part of diagnosis and investigation. So it's very definitely true. The dissection rooms were often so foul-smelling, some students couldn't stay, they would faint or vomit, and then they would quite often go out and they didn't know anything about washing their hands before they would go and then visit other patients and sometimes deliver babies, and there were a lot of cases of women giving birth and dying of puerperal fever afterwards. So, but I can only assume that everybody in George and London was pretty smelly anyway, and so it probably wasn't that much worse than everybody else as well. So that's all I can assume from that. And you're asking about other visitors coming to the anatomy school. They certainly did attract doctors and scientists from all over Britain, so not just medical people, but David Hume and other famous writers and politicians would come to watch them. Erasmus Darwin, I think, came to the anatomy school, so from all over Britain and across Europe, so well-known scientists, Camper and I can't remember the other names now, but also would come to the anatomy school to watch. And in particular, they became famous in America, so because there were no medical schools set up in America, young men who wanted to learn a dissection to become surgeons, their fathers would send them to London. So often they'd go to Edinburgh as well, but they would be sent particularly to London, to William and John's school in Covent Garden, and later to William's school in Great Wimble Street, to learn the art of, to learn dissection and to learn anatomy and surgery. And those pupils went back and they became the founding fathers of American medicine. So they had a huge impact, not just in Britain and Europe, but also in America. And I'm sorry, I don't know I've never come across the name that you mentioned. I think that's probably later because they were running their anatomy school in the mid to late 18th century. So I think that's probably from a later era. So.
Well, my question is related to the obtaining of the bodies, because in the Royal College of Surgeons, one of the disturbing cases is all the dissected fetuses for all the stages of development. And I wonder if there is any record of how many pregnant women he did dissect and how he obtained these bodies. And I think somewhere I heard that there was a high incidence of eclampsia and women dying in pregnancy, and so that might be related to the number of specimens.
Yeah.
I wonder if you're able to comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that to see the fetuses in alcohol is quite disturbing. You have to appreciate too, this is the only way they were going to learn about the pregnant body and the fetus. So I think it perhaps can be justified on those grounds. How did they obtain those pregnant women? And there have been suggestions, and there was one particular paper written which suggested that some of the women were actually murdered to order, which I think there's absolutely no evidence of whatsoever. It's impossible to say for certain that the body snatchers perhaps did not at some point see off some particularly interesting person with an interesting medical disease, as Burke and Hare later obviously did. But that's not actually the way they worked. So essentially, I mean, the paper that I'm talking about was actually saying that because if you go to a graveyard and dig up a body, the chances of it being a pregnant woman are very small. So it's based on this premise. But this is pure speculation because that's not, in fact, how they obtained the body. They didn't randomly go and dig up bodies in graveyards. It was a small world. They knew when pregnant women died. William, of course, was a physician to a lying-in hospital. So when women died in pregnancy, at whatever stage, they often died in his hospital, or if they died elsewhere, he would know about it. It was a very small world. So those women would be buried, and then the nod would go out to the body snatchers to go and lift that body the next night. So that's how it was done. They knew where these women were. In fact, for the human gravid uterus, there was not a very, there were 34 plates, but a lot of those were from the same body. So I think in all there were about 5 or 6 bodies of women, and that was over about a long period of time, for about 10 years, I think, in all. So it was not a huge number, but certainly they obtained those pregnant bodies by the body snatchers providing them. And they saw that as being quite fortuitous. John was very excited when this body, the first body of a woman who actually died in the 9th month of pregnancy, was brought to the dissecting school. So it is obviously shocking to us now, but you have to just remember that this was the only way they were going to learn.
First of all, I'd like to say thank you so much for the talk. It was really wonderful. With regards to John and his surgery, what did they do for anaesthesia back then?
What did they do? Well, they did nothing. Essentially, there wasn't any anaesthesia. And occasionally, you hear people talk about a slug of brandy or maybe a dose of laudanum, which is essentially alcohol mixed with opium. But on the whole, they preferred not to use any anaesthetic because surgeons actually thought that they were more successful in an operation if the patient was alive and screaming. And in some ways, it's possible they were right, because from that they knew the patient was still alive and not sinking. So even when anaesthesia was first used and discovered, a lot of surgeons were very resistant to using it because they thought the pain was beneficial and that it was better that the patient was kicking and screaming rather than flat out. So yeah, I mean, it's staggering, really. I mean, there's several cases of patients having quite long operations sometimes when it's said that they made no sound, they kept completely still. William Pitt, for example, when he had a cyst removed from his cheek by John Hunter, he stood there and he did not flinch. I think it was for 30 seconds. But there are even more shocking stories. Fanny Burney, for example, describes very famously how she had a breast removed by a surgeon in France, and this took about 30 minutes, and she certainly did scream, and she describes it in very sort of graphic detail. But there are other people who, apparently made no sound and did not move at all, so it's quite difficult to believe it, but that's the case, yeah.
Just one final question, perhaps from the other side of the room. Nope. Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Was there any research into chemistry at the time, or for methods of preservation?
In terms of preserving the specimen?
That's right, because the specimens have survived to the current day. So.
Yeah. Yes, that's true. Well, I'm no expert on chemistry, I can assure you, having just about scraped through my GCSE chemistry. I mean, they experimented, though, in terms of the best preservatives for specimens that they kept them in. And they were forms of alcohol, so spirit of wine was the most popular one that was used. But different anatomists had different kind of recipes, which they kept very secret. So they had little kind of cookbooks of their particular recipe for keeping the specimens preserved and fresh, but also different recipes for highlighting the vessels in particular colours. And John Hunter describes very beautifully how he was not just concerned to make sure the specimens survived, but he also wanted them to be aesthetically pleasing. So he talks about using a colour that is most pleasant to the eye rather than a dirty brown colour. But in order to preserve them to this day, they've had to be topped up frequently. So they still have to have the alcohol topped up regularly in order to preserve them. And I know for a fact because one of the curators at the Hunterian Museum who told me about it said you can actually get slightly drunk from sniffing the alcohol if you're not careful. So that's it.